Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and this is Honors Economics Unit 1, and this is the third topic going over demand and supply, which is just kind of a little brief overview of microeconomics in the introductory unit. So we'll look at demand, supply, and equilibrium in the markets for goods and services. These two things come together, demand and supply, especially once we graph them, you'll see that, into a point where they intersect in equilibrium that is the most efficient point basically for producers and consumers. However, both these curves or lines can shift in either direction, and so that has consequences. Changes in equilibrium price and quantity, we'll look at the four-step process and how those things can alter. Price ceilings and price floors, we'll look at how the government usually tries to introduce those and what type of effect it has. And demand, supply, and efficiency, because once again, this is the best point for consumers and producers, so we'll look at why that is. So why does it cost more? Organic vegetables and fruits are grown and sold, and we often look at them and think, well, these are supposed to be healthier, they're supposed to be free of pesticides. And so why do they cost so much more? And the reason why is because a lot more and more people want to buy them, but they're much more difficult to grow. Without the chemical processes that are used in the agricultural system, you can't just grow as much because it's, quite honestly, it's not efficient. They're not able to produce nearly as much. And in fact, if you wanted to engage in organic production of goods, for instance, especially farm, you'd actually have to use even more land, which might even be more environmentally destructive. But anyway, because there's a limited supply of the organic fruits and vegetables, that means that the cost is going to be high, especially as more and more people want them. So demand is basically the consumption. This is what we want and need. In the United States, who gets to demand the goods and services? People that can afford them. So the people that have the ability to purchase them. Now, demand in most cases is from the perspective of individuals going to the marketplace and buying things. But there are many other people that demand and organizations that demand. Businesses buy. They can be demanders. For instance, a bakery demands flour, it demands sugar, and all the other ingredients they need to make their products. Governments demand, they purchase. The federal government is the largest purchaser in the world. So demand, often we think of it just as individual people going to the store, but it actually includes quite a few others as well. Price. Price is the what the buyer pays for a unit of a specific good or service. And when we refer to it as equilibrium price, that will be where the two, demand and supply, intersect. Quantity demanded. And this is different than demand, and that's important to remember. This is the total number of units of a good or service consumers are willing to purchase at any given price. And so we look at the demand curve, and whenever we plot it, that entire line is demand, but each individual point on that line is quantity demanded. And the law of demand is keeping all other variables that affect demand constant. So if price goes up, then the quantity demanded goes down. That's pretty much common sense, isn't it? That if it's expensive, not as many people are going to be willing to buy it. And if price goes down, then quantity demanded goes up. So if the price is lower, like a sale, people are going to want it more often. The demand schedule is a table that shows a range of prices. So on one column, you'll have the number of slices of pizza that will be bought at maybe a booth at a small county fair. And on the right-hand side will be the price for each of them. So maybe for the top layer, or the first one that's listed there, one slice of pizza will be bought if $3 is charged for that particular slice of pizza. And then maybe once you go down further in the table, you'll see that people will be willing to buy 5 slices of pizza, and maybe that's when it's only 50 cents. And so that follows the law of demand. Whenever we take those points and we plot them, and when we do that, we'll see that quantity is on the horizontal axis and price is on the vertical axis. Then we plot each of those points using quantity as the x variable and then price as the y variable. And we'll eventually plot all those points and connect the dots, of course, which will make the demand curve. And here we can see graphing the demand curve, and we can see each of these would be in that table, that demand schedule. And when we plot them, we can see that it eventually makes a curve. And it also, once again, follows the law of demand. When the price is really high, $2.20 per gallon, only 420 million gallons are going to be sold. But when the price is really low, 1 per gallon, 800 million gallons are going to be sold. And so that's why it slopes from top left to bottom right. So the downward slope, again, illustrates the law of demand, the inverse relationship between prices and quantity demanded. Supply is the amount of good or service a producer is willing to supply at each price. So this is what people manufacture and sell. In most cases. Some cases that's not true. We as individual people supply our labor. So when it comes to the labor market, individual people are the suppliers. Quantity supplied is the total number of units. And so once again, don't forget this, that supply is the total curve, the curve in its totality, and then quantity supplied is each individual point on that curve. The law of supply is a little bit different than the law of demand. If price goes up, we are looking at the reaction of suppliers. So if the price of the slices of pizza at the county fair go up and people really are willing to pay $5 for a slice of pizza, then you're going to want to make a heck of a lot more pizza and sell it. And then the person in the booth across the alleyway across from you at the county fair is going to say, wow, they're getting a lot for pizza. I'm going to make it too because they're getting a good price. So supply goes up when price goes up. If the price goes down and you can hardly get anything, you're not going to want to make a lot of pizza. You're going to think about selling something else instead. And so if the price goes down, then the quantity supplied goes down. And of course, just like with demand, we can plot all this into a supply schedule. And once we plot all those points on an actual graph, we have the supply curve. And here we can see the opposite. And it follows the law of supply. When the price is really low, not that much is going to be produced because producers are going to say, I can't get that much money out of it. Why bother? And then the opposite is true. When you can get a lot of money, then a lot is going to be produced. And so it slopes from bottom left to top right. It's an upward slope of the curve, which demonstrates the law of supply. Equilibrium is where these two intersect, a combination of price and quantity, where there is no economic pressure from surpluses or shortages that would cause a price or quantity to change. It is where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The equilibrium price is where those two lines intersect, where quantities of these two variables equal each other. The equilibrium quantity is the place that is best. This many will be purchased, this many will be sold, and it will also occur at that intersection point. Surplus or excess supply is any point where supply is greater than demand. So when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And shortage is the opposite. And that is going to be when the demand is greater than the supply. More people want it than is available. So here we can see the demand and supply curves plotted and where they reach equilibrium. Here we can see that where they intersect, the equilibrium price is $1.40 and the equilibrium quantity is 600. So 600 are going to be purchased, 600 are going to be supplied. This is the best price possible. Each point above that, look here, this is, let's go one they actually have marked off. That's a little bit less. Let's say this is 680 quantity. So at $1.80, a lot of producers are going to say, hey, let's supply this. So 680 units will be available. But at the same $1.80, that's really expensive. So only 500 are going to be bought. So you end up with a surplus of 180. And each of these points, more is being supplied than what is demanded. More is being supplied than what is demanded. More is being supplied than what is demanded. So every point up here where supply is greater is called the surplus. And the opposite is true. Down here, a lot of people want this product at $1 each. And so they're going to demand 800, let's say each person is buying one unit, 800 people are going to want to buy this. But at that price, suppliers are saying that's not really worth it. So they're only going to supply 500. So there is an excess of 300 that is wanted to be bought. And so because that demand exceeds the supply, you end up with a shortage. So every point in here is a shortage. Ceteris paribus is a Latin phrase that means other things equal. Any given demand or supply curve is based on the ceteris paribus assumption that all else is held equal. So everything else remain the same. Any changes on any point in here just involves price and quantity. That's it. Nothing else is going to change. The demand curve can be used to identify how much consumers would buy at any given price. And so here we can see the quantity, and here we can see the price. So at this price, this is how much people would be willing to buy. This price up here is going to be a different quantity. This price down here is going to be a different quantity. If income increases, though, for normal goods, most people are going to buy more of these or willing to pay for more of these. And so you can see that demand is going to increase. So if everybody all of a sudden has a job and they're making decent income, they can all go out and buy things. Then the demand is going to increase and it's going to shift to the right. So this is when demand increases. An increase in demand means that at every given price, the quantity demanded is higher, so that the demand curve shifts to the right. A decreased demand means the opposite, that it shifts to the left. So here we can see the original demand curve. This is if everyone's income goes up, everybody has a job, lots of people get laid off, and their income goes down, demand shifts back to here. A shift in demand happens when a change in some economic factor other than price causes a different quantity to be demanded at every price. Factors that affect demand include income, changing tastes or preferences which can be based on advertising. People get excited about something. It's popular. They want to go out and buy it too. That increases demand. Changes in the composition of population. As the baby boomers have been going through the years, when they were young, there was a big demand for baby products. When they got to their teenage years, cars, clothes, other types of things would go up in demand. And then once people get to their early to mid-20s, then maybe home purchases start to go up. And so through each stage of their lives, they have caused an increase in a certain type of demand for products. The price of substitute or complementary changes. And so if there is a substitute available, easily available, you really don't have a lot of price flexibility for your product. So for instance, looking at different types of apples, if you're an orchard that sells Macintosh apples and your price skyrockets, people can just go out and buy Granny apples instead. And so if there's a substitute available, that will impact exactly the supply and demand curves. And complements can change things as well. So if you have, for instance, spaghetti and spaghetti noodles, the demand of those two products is often going to be tied together. If the demand for one is going to go up, the other probably will as well. And expectations about the future. If people know there's going to be a sale next week, then the quantity demand this week is probably going to be low, and vice versa. So a list of factors that can increase demand and those that can decrease. Increasing demand, taste shift to greater popularity, population likely to buy rises, income rises, price of substitutes rises, so people are going to buy your product instead. Price of complements falls, so, this goes together and that price fell, maybe I'll buy this too. Future expectations encourage buying because you're worried about a sale next week. And then the opposite of that, the demand shift is going to happen in the opposite direction, decreasing to the left if there is a shift to lesser popularity. Population likely to buy drops. Maybe baby boomers are done being young adults, so those products are going to fall in demand. Income drops. Price substitution falls. And the price complement rises. So all these things will help demand diminish. That is true for most goods, but not all. I mentioned the phrase normal good. This is a product whose demand rises with income and vice versa. An inferior good is the opposite, though. So actually, as your income rises for normal goods, demand for normal products will shift to the left, or to the right, it will increase. And then the opposite is true. As your income rises, inferior goods like ramen noodles, your demand for those is going to decrease. A substitute is a good or service that we can use in place of another one, easily switched out, they're similar, and complements are goods that go together. Just to go over those terms again. The supply curve, we can also use that to determine the quantity at each price for supply. How much are they going to be able to produce or want to produce at this particular price? The cost of production and the desired profit equal the price a firm will sell for the product. So the desired product and the cost of production is going to make up these two, or this particular point. Because the cost of production and the desired profit equal the price a firm will sell for a product, if the cost of production increases, then the price of the product will also need to increase. So if it took you $1 to produce a donut, for instance, then you are going to have to raise your price that you charge to customers if it costs $2 to make a donut. So cost of production is one of the things that can change supply. So, as you can see here, if the cost of production is going to go up, then they might not be able to produce as much. So supply is actually going to decrease. So when supply decreases, all the quantities are going this way, even though they have these arrows going up. So the supply decrease is going to shift to the left. So this is a shift to the left. That is a supply decrease. If they get a new means of technology to help them produce donuts even faster, then that would be an increase in supply at all price levels. And so it will shift to the right. So shift to supply is when a change in some economic factor other than price causes a different quantity to be provided at each price level. Inputs or factors of production, these kind of things will help out with supply. The more available they are, the more they can supply. So land, labor, and capital. So natural conditions, input prices, technology, government policies like subsidies or lower taxes will all help increase supply. So there you can see supply increasing, favorable natural conditions, no bad weather or anything like that. Fall in input prices, so cost of production goes down. Better technology to help them produce faster. Lower taxes, less regulations, all will help them produce more. And then all the opposite is true, will help decrease supply. So the four-step process now to determine economic event affects equilibrium price and quantity is draw a demand and supply model before it took place, decide whether the economic change affects demand or supply, and decide whether the effect causes a curve shift to the right or to the left, and sketch the new curve on the diagram, and identify the new equilibrium and then compare it to the original. So here is a supply curve, the first one. Here is the second one where supply is increased, and there's demand. So you can see at the old price, $3.25, when the supply increases, the price drops to $2.50. So when supply increases, prices drop. And here we can see that there are two demand curves. Here's the original demand and the price. And you can see when demand falls, the price is going to fall as well. This would involve the Postal Service. And so quantity is the units, if we can measure them, of availability of Postal Service. So the quantity of Postal Service here, and the price of it there. So a couple things happen. Higher labor compensation. So let's say the postal workers negotiate higher pay, and so therefore it's more expensive to operate the Postal Service, so they can't have as much supply occurring. And so when that takes place, the supply curve shifts to the left. And so the quantity available of the supply at this particular price point you can see is lower than it was before at the equilibrium. Then a change in taste away from Postal Service causes a leftward shift in the demand curve. So people want to use email instead, for instance. They don't want to use it anymore. And so perhaps there is a drop in demand. So the quantity demanded also decreases at the same time. So you can see that it happens at each of these points, but more importantly at the equilibrium, it's going to show that a lesser price is going to be the result, because we look at the first one, the equilibrium 0 and the equilibrium 2. I'm using the number 2 because this is the other graph. Superimposing the previous two diagrams one on top of the other, we see that the supply and demand shifts cause changes in equilibrium price and quantity. So we can see the shift in the supply curve. They can't supply as much because of the increased cost. And so the new equilibrium is there. People don't want to use the post office as much, so demand drops. And so the new equilibrium in that case would be there. But we have to look at it from the perspective as we have a new supply curve and a new demand curve. So this is the new supply curve, and this is the new demand curve. So where they intersect, this E3 is where the new equilibrium is going to be. And we can see because of that, that quantity is reduced even further than the introduction of the new supply curve separately or the introduction of the new demand curve separately. But at the same time, we can also see that the price isn't going to exactly be the same either. So it's different than the original. It's different from the decreased supply. And it's different than the decreased demand. So it's actually going to be not too far off from where the original equilibrium was going to be, but it's definitely not as high or low in these two separate situations. Moments are different than shifts. A shift in one curve never causes a shift in another curve. Rather, a shift in one curve causes a movement along the second curve. So this shifting outward did not impact the original demand curve. And this change in the demand curve had nothing to do with the change in the other supply curve increase. So these changes are all separate, and they just cause movement this way, or eventually out to here. They cause movement along the curves themselves. The government, of course, does try to intervene, especially if it is for a basic necessity or something that the people in a certain area or demographic or geography need. And so price ceilings establish a maximum price, a price that can go no further by law, and a price floor sets a bare minimum. It can go no lower by law. So one of the classic examples of price ceiling would be rent control. In especially crowded cities, the government will attempt to put some type of maximum price on rent. It could go no higher than this because people are paying $3,000-$4,000 for a very small apartment a month in the year 2020, which is an exorbitant amount of money. And people, especially that have unskilled or semi-skilled labor jobs that are lower in pay, they definitely can't afford any type of housing. And so they establish these rent controls, which have good intentions, but unfortunately they don't always have the best outcomes. So here we can see the original intersection of demand and supply occurs at E0. So this is the original supply of housing. This is the original demand of housing. Let's say there are 15,000 rental units available, and this is $500. Let's say it says a month. That doesn't sound that high, obviously, but they're trying to keep the numbers simple here. But anyway, if demand shifts from D0 to D1, the new equilibrium would be at E1. So here's what happens. They set the price ceiling. Well, this is where the equilibrium is. So let's say that this is the maximum amount that we would want people to charge for rent. So demand, of course, if people know, oh, it's not going to be higher than this, you're going to have more people demanding that they're going to go out and purchase housing or renting housing. So you're going to have more people that are going to want to rent, more renters. And so the new equilibrium is going to shift. If the price is not permitted to rise to that point, though, the demand is shifted outwards, and it should go out to here, but remember, it's not allowed to go higher than this price ceiling. If the price is not permitted to rise, the quantity supplied remains at 15,000. And so it's going to remain back here where the original equilibrium was. However, after the change in demand, the quantity demanded rises to 19,000. So that's way out to here at that price level. So at 500, this is how much people want. If the price can go no further, the supply is going to be back here. Not as many people are going to want to lease their places if they're only going to get $500. And this is where the equilibrium should be if the demand curve shifts out that much, but it's not allowed to go that high. So the result is here we have, of course, demand that is greater than supply. And so we're going to have about 4,000 people that aren't going to be able to find somewhere because there aren't enough rental units available. And they're using the price floor of wheat often. Another one is the minimum wage, but we'll look at their wheat example. And so this is the supply of wheat. This is the demand of wheat. This is the equilibrium. And so we want to establish a minimum price. It has to be higher than that. It has to be higher than the equilibrium. And so they established this price floor, which is known as P of F. And once again, we're going to not go where the equilibrium is. At the price floor, we're going to see a change in supply and demand. The result of the price floor is that the quantity supplied, or QS, because farmers who grow wheat are going to say, look, the government is saying we're going to get this much more. So a lot more people are going to want to supply wheat. And it is greater than at that price point that really people are willing to pay. And so only this many people are willing to pay at that price. And so there is a surplus. The surplus is supply greater than demand. So in both cases, you end up with some kind of negative consequence, a shortage or a surplus. Now let's look at consumer surplus and producer surplus. And so this is the benefit that both get by either not paying as much or getting more money than they might have at all other points in the opposite direction of where their surplus would be. A social surplus is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. So this is both of them combined. Deadweight loss in the social surplus that occurs when a market produces an inefficient quantity. And so we'll look more at that later. Surprise, surprise, one of the biggest causes of deadweight loss are taxes. Monopolies can also cause deadweight loss as well. But consumer and producer surplus, here we can see the supply curve, and here we can see the demand curve. An equilibrium point at 28 of quantity, 28 million, and then the price is $80. The somewhat triangular area labeled F shows the consumer surplus. And the reason why it says that is because every point above this equilibrium, the consumer would have had to pay more money. And not shockingly, the opposite of that is the producer surplus. Every point below that, the producer would have gotten less money. Somewhat triangular area labeled by G shows the area of producer surplus. So F is consumer, G is producer. And speaking of efficiency, let's introduce the idea of a price ceiling and price floor. Just take a little bit more look at that. And so once again, this is the equilibrium. And so this area here is a surplus. This area below that is a surplus. This is the consumer surplus. This is the producer surplus. So that is before the price ceiling is put into place. Remember, the price ceiling is a maximum. So the original equilibrium price is 600 and the equilibrium quantity is 20,000 units. So the consumer surplus is this area, T and U, and the producer surplus is V, W, and X. So it's this entire area here. The price ceiling is imposed. Let's say this is for rent, and the local government says rent can be no higher than $400 a month. And so it can go no higher than this. So now you're going to have this many people that want to rent and only this many landlords that are going to want to provide rental units. And so remember, we actually ended up with a shortage in this particular case. So a price ceiling is imposed. So firms in the market now produce only a quantity of 15,000, but people are going to want more than 20,000 units. As a result, the new consumer surplus is going to be shortchanged. Since this is the new price, it's going to be squeezed over this way, so it's going to be shortchanged in this respect, but it expands into this area. So now we have T and V together. That will be the new consumer surplus. The producer surplus is going to be shortened much further, and there is no room for expansion, so it's not going to expand into any other area of the graph. So it used to have, for instance, when it's below this point, it had V, W, and X. Now it is just going to be, since this is the new point, in this X area. So the producer surplus is drastically reduced. Over here we can see the impact of a price floor. And here they say, look, let's go back to the wheat producers, for instance. They can only get $8, let's say a bushel. We would like them to get $12 a bushel. So let's put in this price floor. It can go no lower than this. All the prices have to be higher that it's sold at. So at least has to be at 12. And of course, it's only going to go to 12 because that's artificial. It was never going to go higher to begin with. So the original equilibrium was $8 and 1,800 units. Whenever we establish this price floor, we can see that it's going to change. The new supply is going to be out to here. A lot more people are going to want to supply, well over 2,000. And then, of course, the number of people are going to want to buy is going to be only 1,400. So new seller's point, more people are going to supply, less people are going to buy at the $12. But before that price floor is put into effect, this is the old equilibrium. And so the consumer surplus is G, H, and J. And the producer surplus is K and I. And you can see it's just going to be the flip of the other scenario. So whenever you raise this surplus or raise this price floor, now the consumer surplus is only going to be G. Because remember, they're being hurt by this. They're being forced to pay more than they would have naturally in a free-flowing marketplace controlled by the invisible hand. So now the government's hand is going to slap this price right up to $12, and so the consumer surplus is going to be drastically reduced. It used to be this entire area, and now it's just going to be G. And so from a geometric visual standpoint, you can see the mathematical change here by the fact that the surface area of the consumer surplus is drastically reduced. And then we could look at the producer surplus. They're actually getting a lot more out of this deal. So the producer surplus is going to be, or it used to be just I and K. Now it's going to be both H and I because the intersection point up here. So H and I, so there's this entire area. So now this producer surplus is obviously much more advantageous than the consumer surplus. And there's not really any equality at all that's happening there. That's some of the danger, and probably one of the better ones that is often illustrated is the minimum wage. So if we could just replace this for a minute. Let's say instead of 1,400, this is 1,400, and this is $14 an hour, and this is $18 an hour. Or I'm sorry. Let's say this is the price. Let's say the current minimum wage the current equilibrium is $8 an hour. Let's say the current minimum wage is $7.25. It's down here. That doesn't matter. Most businesses are willing to pay a little bit more to attract employees, so it's $8 an hour. That's where the equilibrium is. So let's say we want to impose a new minimum wage. Lots of people are talking about 15. The compromise is made at 12. And so the new price floor for the minimum wage is set here. Now, of course, a lot more people are going to want to supply their labor, and a lot more people supplying their labor means that there's going to be abundance of people willing to work. But some businesses will say, well, we can't hire as many, we can't afford that much, so not as many people are going to be offered jobs. And so the demand for labor is going to be back here. So it's actually going to decrease by, let's say, 600 people in a small town, for instance. And so you're going to end up with possibly, let's say, 2,000 people wanting to work at that wage, but there's only 1,400 jobs available. So whenever this happens, we end up this gap in between these 2 points is the surplus of labor, and so that means there is unemployment. That's what a surplus of labor means. It means more people are willing to sell their labor than what are jobs available. So we end up with a surplus of labor, aka unemployment. And so we can actually see what unemployment is going to look like in that scenario from a geometric, mathematical, visual standpoint. And then if we look at, continue to use this example, if we look at the economy in a different light, where the supply and demand, the gap between the two isn't as big. So for instance, let's use this graph for example. If you put a minimum wage in here above the equilibrium, those points in between aren't going to be as broad as this here. So looking at how the employment or labor market is performing could also help figure out exactly when the minimum wage should go up if you wait for years and just raise it periodically. If there is a large gap between supply and demand, you're going to end up with more unemployment. If there is a smaller gap between supply and demand, that's not going to be the case. But all of this, of course, ties into microeconomics. And just one other thing that we'll talk about later on would be something outside of just simply supply and demand, and that would be elasticity. And that's that products typically have a reaction to price changes. And so whenever we look at the law of demand here, price goes up, then quantity demanded goes down. But the question is, how much does that change? So if the price goes up, for instance, on a pack of cigarettes, the quantity demanded goes down, but it doesn't go down that much. But if the price goes up on glazed donuts, the quantity demanded is going to go down much further than it would for cigarettes. So if you had the price go up by 50% for a pack of cigarettes and the price went up 50% for glazed donuts, you would see that the quantity demanded is going to go down much further for the glazed donuts, because the pack of cigarettes, even though it isn't a necessity for human beings biologically speaking, it is for the people who have become addicted to it. And so because of that necessity, we say that the quantity that is going to be purchased isn't going to drop that much, because demand in this case is very inelastic. And so when that happens, when a product is inelastic, it means the price can go up quite a bit more than it can for products that are not. The opposite of that, the donuts, would be an elastic product, which means the demand is incredibly flexible. And so people who sell elastic goods and services, things that are more on the luxury end of the spectrum, they're not much of a necessity, those people have to watch their price changes carefully. If you sell an inelastic good, though, you can raise your prices and you're not going to lose that much in customers at all. And that's incredibly beneficial. And then the opposite of that, of course, is supply. There's also elasticity of supply. And if so the price goes up, then the supply should go up. But the question is, are they able to do it? And you might wonder, well, why the heck wouldn't they do that? If you're going to get more money out of it, why wouldn't you try to sell more? Well, maybe they can't. You know, if it's a bakery and the price goes up for those glazed donuts, they're going to want to make a lot more donuts. And they probably can. They can order the extra bulk of ingredients the next day to be delivered, or within 2 days, and they can start making more donuts right away. An apple orchard, though, if the price goes up for apples, they really can't produce a lot more apples right away. And for a lot of crops, that's true. A lot of them, especially if they have a year-round turnaround time period till they mature and they can sell the product, they're not going to be able to do. Oil is another example. The price goes up. Oil exploration is often long and difficult, and it's not like you're going to be able to increase all of a sudden within even a year, maybe your productivity by 20 or 30%. The only way they do that, of course, is if they already have access to the wells. They've already been drilled and they've just been holding back supply. If the price goes up, then they can certainly turn on the faucet, so to speak, and supply more oil. But if that's not the case, if they do have to go out and do more drilling, then we say in that case that the supply is not flexible. So for products that it takes a while for the productivity to catch up to prices, we refer to that as an inelastically supplied good. Whereas if you can make a quick turnaround and increase the supply, then we say in reference to supply itself that is an elastic good. So what is the best type of product to sell? The best type of product to sell is an inelastically demanded good that is elastically supplied. But we'll talk more about this later, and we will also talk more from a microeconomic sense about businesses, how they're categorized, both individually and as an industry. So we'll talk more about that later because that also ties into some of this involving supply and demand.